Research literacy. My name is Catherine McCrory and I'm a lecturer in history education at the Institute of Education here at UCL, and I mostly work on the history PGCE. And I want to talk today about research literacy in teacher education. I've broken the lecture into three parts. Firstly, from your perspective, you can ask yourself, do I know what is meant by research literacy, and am I thinking about why it might matter? Secondly, do I know what fields of research I need to draw upon, and am I thinking about why I should be drawing on all of these? And lastly, do I know what I need in order to be able to understand and use research well? So part one, do I know what we mean by research literacy in teacher education? Some people mean that teachers should be consumers of research, that they should be research literate and be able to understand the research that is produced by others. So for example, here I've got Rob Coe talking about evidence-based education in his new manifesto. And I should maybe say that all of the references are in the notes in the slides and available on Moodle. The extract I want to share is where he defines what is meant by evidence-based education. And he says it's described as an approach which argues that policy and practice should be capable of being justified in terms of sound evidence about their likely effects. Research can never tell teachers what to do, nor should it. It can, however, help provide teachers and leaders with what Professor Steve Higgins and others have called best bets. It can and should provide the theory underpinning the action in classrooms. Other people mean something slightly different by research literacy. Here is Lawrence Stenhouse, and he's talking about teachers as the producers of research, as teacher researchers. And here what he has in mind is that teaching is a sort of a researching activity, a research-like activity. And he says that the curriculum research and development ought to belong to the teacher. So it's not enough that teachers' work should be studied, they need to study it themselves. I'd argue that we need both ideas within our definition of research literacy in teacher education. As a consumer of research, you need to be able to, well, actually, let's just talk about how they're slightly different from each other, first of all. So to be able to produce an academic paper in education is not the same as being able to teach an enriching lesson, which is research informed. So there clearly is a difference in the two activities. But to be able to understand the research findings, you need to know the basics of how research is conducted. So you can't be research literate, you can't be a good, healthy consumer of research unless you understand the basics of social science research. But the thing is, you as a teacher do not just have to understand the research, you have to act on it, to apply it in behaviours. And therefore, you will also have to learn to question and test research as part of your understanding of its appropriate classroom application. If consuming research as a teacher includes using research, so understanding research isn't an end in itself, but you have to apply it in the classroom, then you need to engage in a form of investigating, not in order to produce an academic paper about some feature of the classroom, but rather investigating as a way to learn to use diverse bodies of knowledge to teach well. So what I'm trying to say is that turning book smarts or research that you happen to read produced in other fields into smart behaviours, that is, into practices in your own teaching that influence other people's learning, that is in itself a research-like activity. And therefore you need to be not just thought of as a consumer of research, but also considered as someone who engages in research-like activity. And in fact, when you are planning and evaluating and teaching your lessons, those are your field notes. That's not paperwork. That is you engaging in a practice that is an investigation into what others understand and how you influence that understanding. So you are a consumer and a producer of research. Now, part two, do I know what fields of research I need to draw on? And am I thinking about why I should be drawing on all of these and not just a few of them? I've sort of made a distinction between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge, saying that it's not enough that you should be able to read academic papers about research in education and in your field in education, but that you also need to be able to apply them in practice. And that seems to set up this divide between theory and practice. And actually, whilst we can think of those two activities as separate, I hope I've made the point that actually we need to think of them as interdependent upon each other. And what you're doing is actually a research-like activity too. And so I really like Donald McIntyre's thinking based up in Oxford about teachers as practical theorizers. They are engaged in this activity that is practical theorizing. And the way I like to think of it is that you are revealing your theory and your understanding of theory through your practice. What it is that you do in the classroom is a manifestation of your grasp of the theoretical issues involved. What McIntyre was doing when he was working back in the 90s, and he was really responding to this separation between theory and practice and thinking about how to integrate theory and practice. And he was partly concerned about a popular view at the time, which was that to become a teacher education is simply a reflective process. And he was trying to speak against that sort of narrow vision of teaching as reflective, and that's it. What he was trying to say, what he was worried about, was that if we just think of it as a beginner teaching their lesson and then reflecting on how that went and making some changes, the issue is that they have so little knowledge of what they're looking at and what they're engaged in as an activity as a beginner, that the danger is that they are really only seeing their own reflection mirrored back to them. And what we need to do is yes, absolutely, don't get rid of reflection. Of course, it's a reflective activity, but what are you reflecting in light of? And you need to be reflecting in light of what is already known about the practice that you're engaging in. And he felt that was a more productive way of thinking about teacher education. And so that brings me to the fact that we would advocate a rich frame of reference for you. The key is your ability to integrate this rich frame of reference. And I've just laid out there some 3 broad categories. So your own perspectives, experiences so far is an incredibly rich and essential component of your understanding of teaching and learning in your subject. Secondly, the academic research, empirical and theoretical, that's available to you. And thirdly, teachers' experience, mentors, colleagues, talking in the staff room, reading blogs written by teachers, practitioner journals where they talk about their teaching experiences. This is another rich vein of information that you could be drawing upon and should be drawing on. So just to lay them out there, you've got subject knowledge. For me as a historian, I'm actually reading historians' works and I'm keeping abreast of what's happening within my subject so that my teaching isn't out of date. But there's also subject-specific teaching and learning. So, for example, there's a practitioner journal called Teaching History, written by teachers and for teachers largely, where they discuss their work. And it's been decades now of work of teachers sharing their everyday classroom practice. And there's also books specifically about history education, so debates in history teaching, and you will have these on your reading list for the PGCE. But there's also generic or non-subject specific academic work that's available to you, and that would be, for example, science of learning or books from cognitive psychology or neuroscience, and these also help you. They're not specific to history or to physics or any single subject. They are talking generically about learning what we know about memory, what we know about motivation, these sorts of things that are applicable across subjects. And if I had to sort of just open a footnote, it would be to say that probably the single most detrimental thing that you can do to jeopardize your progress is lose access to your subject-specific teaching and learning community, no matter how fledgling that might be. So just to reinforce that point, there's a very helpful book, and it's a book about the general knowledge that is out in the fields of related to education, and it's How People Learn. It's an American book, and it's available online for free if you simply sign up to receive that PDF. And this is its 2nd edition, and it's very useful at bringing together different research findings that are helpful to educators. And one of the things that they say is that, to quote, variations across subject areas, so from history to physics to geography to English literature or whatever, variations across subject areas in the structure of knowledge, epistemologies, and disciplinary practices are as important to the design of effective learning experiences for students as the general principles of learning discussed in the previous chapters. Indeed, the growing bodies of evidence related to learning in specific disciplines are supporting current efforts to improve kindergarten and 12th grade education. So, subject specificity really matters. A rich frame of reference really matters. But for all of the richness of the research that's available to you, I think it's also important that you think about the limits of research, what research can answer, what it cannot answer, and what it has not answered yet. So I find it quite helpful. There's a nice analogy of different types of problems, questions that you might want to investigate or ask about, and how these different types of problems have a different nature. So for instance, if I were to throw a stone, it's conceivable that I could quite accurately estimate where that stone might land based on its weight and the power of the throw and whatever. But if I were to throw a bird, that would become a wholly different adventure, because the bird has agency. The bird can decide to fly off, and that makes it incredibly difficult. It's not the same question, and it's not the same nature of investigation, because the subject matter differs. The tools available to us differ. And so it's quite helpful to, when we're thinking about the limits of research, not just to think about there are questions that research can't answer for us, normative questions about what we value and why we should value it, but even within questions that can be answered by some forms of research, it's important to think about how appropriate is it to apply the sorts of the paradigm or the theoretical framework that we're using. How appropriate is that for the question? Is this question that we are interested in answering lending itself to the research approach that we've adopted? And Baista is very helpful in just asking us to slow down and have a think about what do we mean by evidence-based practice. And as a caution, he says the idea has its origins in the field of medicine. This idea that education and teachers' work in the classroom should be informed by research comes from the field of medicine. And it's not a neutral framework. There's an assumption that sits behind it, and it's that the world has a causal model behind it, that there's cause and effect, and the world is like the rock problem rather than the bird problem, and it can be measured in a way that is appropriate to rocks throwing and not birds throwing. So Baista says this is particularly problematic in the field of education, and we can see why, because apart from the obvious fact that the condition of being a student is quite different from that of being a patient, being a student is not an illness, just as teaching is not a cure. The most important argument against the idea that education is a causal process lies in the fact that education is not a process of physical interaction, but a process of symbolic and symbolically mediated interaction. If teaching is to have any effect on learning, it is because of the fact that students interpret and try to make sense of what they're being taught. It is only through processes of mutual interpretation that education is possible. So Baista rings a cautionary note that we would do well to listen to when we think about the limits of this notion of evidence-based practice. So is Coe claiming too much? Earlier I said in his manifesto, the evidence-based education manifesto, he said that evidence-based education is an approach which argues that policy and practice should be capable of being justified in terms of sound evidence about their likely effects. So is he saying too much? Well, you know, there are things that you can see with a microscope, and there are things that you can see with a telescope, and there's things you can't see unless you set down both. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about. So when he says evidence-based education and that what we do in the classroom should be justified in terms of sound evidence, what does he mean by sound evidence? What counts as sound evidence? What's the measure of that? Does that mean that all policy and practice should be capable of being justified this way? If that's what he means, then gosh, I as a teacher, I do very little, because there's very little evidence out there. There's very little research available to me in history education about what I should be doing. We just don't have that research yet, and we won't have lots of that research because it's not the sorts of things that can be researched with the tools that we have available to us. Are we in danger of succumbing to a pretense of evidence-ism, that we can have, or that we even need a particular form of evidence for all of our practice? Is there a place for reason, even for intuition, to underpin practice when particular forms of evidence do not exist or suffice? And what about the side effects of our policy and practice? There's an interesting article there about how even the research we do have, let's say it's into retrieval practice and memory, fine, but why aren't we, if we are going to follow this model from medicine, why aren't we looking into the side effects if what happens when our classroom becomes dominated by this particular piece of evidence on memory and retrieval practice to the detriment of other things that we should be considering? So we don't even, with things that we know are effective, like retrieval practice, we haven't actually investigated yet the side effects of when it's applied in this way. What are the unintended consequences? Most important of all, I think, is the idea that we have evidence for more than one course of action in any moment. And so the decision to prioritise this evidence-based policy or practice over that one isn't answered by research, isn't answered by the evidence that we have. It comes down at the end of the day to a professional decision that has to be made in the context that we're facing. So we don't get to sidestep the issue of interpretation and application of research. And there's quite a nice podcast by Dylan Williams where he talks about how everything works somewhere and nothing works everywhere. And this notion of deciding what research to apply in what moment and how is actually as big a deal for us as teacher educators and for you as teachers. It's as important in research literacy as simply knowing what research is out there and what it happens to say. So there are questions that research can't answer, and a powerful misconception worth exploring for you is the idea that evidence can prescribe ends in education. It can't. We need to decide what we value. It also can't, as I just said, it can't offer us rules for action, because those rules we need to spot that this is the moment that rule applies, and this rule as opposed to that rule, and then how do we implement it? And research falls short when it comes to those professional decisions that we face in a day-to-day way. So really what research evidence can provide us as teachers with is hypotheses for problem solving. It can't do more than that. Research into what works can only be used as an instrument in professional action. It can't tell us what to do. Research evidence ought not to be used to circumvent professional judgment. So you need to develop not just your ability to read research and knowing what research is out there, you need to also develop your ability to make those professional judgments for yourself on the basis of that rich frame of reference that we've talked about. Of course, you want rules of action, you want guidance, you want to know what we already know in order to feel classroom ready, and we understand that. But you also need to develop your professional judgment in order to maximise the learning and life chances of all pupils. Both strains are needed in your education. I am not saying anything in that about how we don't need evidence or how we don't need research. That's absolutely not my point. There is fantastic best bet information out there that we should be using. There's a good deal of consistency between how learners learn, whether it's physics or history or geography or whatever, because despite differences between people, the architecture of the brain is similar from person to person, and we can therefore gather evidence of what happens under particular conditions. Just because we can't say everything doesn't mean that we can't say anything or that we can say whatever we please. And just because we cannot say conclusively for sure doesn't mean that we cannot say plausibly. Just because we cannot determine by observation or experiment doesn't mean that we can't explore and express ideas in ways that accord with logic. And just because that we are prone to various problems understanding and interpreting research, and we don't have enough research, does not mean that we can ignore research. So in no way am I being cynical about research. I'm saying research plus the ability to develop your professional judgment. So you are a consumer of research, and in teaching, you are engaging in a research-like activity. And secondly, there's a rich frame of reference out there that you can draw on as practical theorizers. And secondly, if you're going to do that well, you need to understand and have a really good grasp of what research can and cannot do for you. So part 3 then. Do I know what I need in order to be able to understand and to use research well? Well, I'm going to talk about a couple of things. One is, I think to be a good consumer of research, you need a sort of basic grasp of social science, and lots of people listening to this lecture have a very good grounding in social science research. So I'm not going to labour this. I am going to offer a couple of places that you can look up the sorts of things I'm talking about, both theoretical frameworks that inform research and also the strengths and weaknesses of different research methodologies and some of the key terms that are used in research. And I'll offer you those readings so that you can follow up on your own on the basics so that you become a healthy and good reader, consumer of research. What's more important from my perspective is to try to give you some tools that will help you to do that well and to use research well as a researcher yourself, as teaching as a research-like activity. So I've tried to sort of help by giving you sort of 4 memory aids to take you through the sorts of things that you can just have in the back of your mind, both as you read, as you hear advice and guidance, and as you try to act on it. The 4 ideas I'm going to offer you is there's a part-whole problem to be aware of. There's a ruler problem, there's a problem of changing domains, and there's a problem of seeing. So by looking at these problems and to have these 4 ideas, aide-memoire type notions in your mind just to be aware of, the idea is to develop your ability to question and test. What do we mean by a part-whole problem? Well, you know, we often think that we've seen the whole of the moon when actually the whole other side of the moon that we haven't seen. This is, yeah, you get a part of the picture and you think you've got the whole, and that distorts your understanding. Also, there's a ruler problem, and the idea here is that 12-inch rulers can only measure 12-inch things. There's a changing lanes problem, and what I mean here is that when we have information and knowledge in one domain, let's say cognitive psychology, just for an example, when we try to apply that into a different domain, teaching history, for example, sometimes we don't exercise enough care in, you know, how we need to be sensitive to the fact that we've changed domains. And lastly, we have a problem ourselves with our own limitations in terms of, you know, we only see what we are, what we want to see or what we are ready to see. So I think if we keep these 4 ideas in mind as we engage in reading, consuming research, and in implementing and putting research into practice in our daily lessons, I think this could help us. So if we look at the first idea of, you know, the basics of social science research, this idea of there's different theoretical frameworks, that's true. You know, if you look at the philosophy of education, the history of education, sociology of education, within each of those fields have a different theoretical framework from the other, perhaps, but then also within those fields, there are different researching traditions, or they're coming from different perspectives. And it's just worth knowing that, because it's worth looking at, well, where this finding that I'm reading about, this thing I'm trying out in my classroom, what's the basis of this? What perspective on the world is it coming from, so to speak? I'm just going to take one example here from cognitive psychology. And Daniel Willingham is an American cognitive psychologist who has been incredibly helpful in education, and he's been very influential in Britain. And so he lays out in this particular article, within cognitive psychology, the 3 sort of perspectives or different theoretical frameworks that are at play. Most educational psychology textbooks differentiate among 3 broad approaches to psychological theory: behaviorism, information processing, and constructivism, which differ in their assumptions about how knowledge and learning ought to be viewed. Behaviorists operationalize abstract concepts, for example, hunger or learning, as observable behaviors, and knowledge is characterized as relationships among observable events. So think rats and Pavlov's dog and those sorts of experiments. Psychologists, adopting an information processing perspective, characterize knowledge as mental symbols and processes, and learning as a change in these symbols, processes, or both. Within constructivism, advocates of situated cognition characterize knowledge as embedded in social contexts and in the concrete situations where learning occurs. Despite much heated interchange in the late 90s, it remains unclear whether constructivism or information processing offers more promise. So there's three broad theoretical positions within cognitive psychology: behaviorist, cognitivist, and constructivist. Each is informed by different assumptions about what sort of a thing knowledge is and what sort of an activity teaching and learning are. If you know that, if you know what you're reading is coming from this perspective, that should make you a more informed reader. So we take cognitive psychology again, and here are the learning scientists. Again, these are Americans, very influential in British education, and helpfully so, I would say. So this book and their website is referenced in the notes underneath, but this book is Understanding How We Learn. And if you notice what they say about their own book, it is, we are writing this book to tell you what we know about learning from a cognitive perspective. And what I say there is, do they mean by that from a cognitivist perspective? That is, are they thinking about knowledge and the work, teaching and learning and the work that they are doing and the research they're doing as information processing? In which case, to go back to how Willingham was explaining that, they're characterizing knowledge as mental symbols and processes, and learning as a change in these symbols, processes, or both. And that's fine, but that has an influence. So we have their really useful findings from cognitive psychology. We understand much more about spaced practice, about retrieval practice, about the role of elaboration in learning, about concrete examples, and about dual coding. And I've put some of the research there as a list if you want to look into it. It's incredibly useful information. Very informative to help us think about our practice. For me, as a history teacher, for example. The thing is, that is from one theoretical perspective, which views the world in a very particular way. And it's, if we allow that to dominate our thinking and think that's the whole rather than a part, then that will distort our understanding of what is happening in our practice. So that to say that there's more going on isn't to say there's less going on. So it's not knocking those findings from cognitive psychology in any way. It's just saying we need more than just that. And if we just have that, what we've got is a distortion, and perhaps a dangerous distortion. So even within cognitive psychology, even within the cognitivist approach within cognitive psychology, to think that just those 6 learning strategies captures what's happening in your classroom is ludicrous. There's other aspects, and I'd like to talk about those in the next slide, but then there's also the regulative and the emotional side of learning. And this idea that, you know, that it's some sort of detached reason-based activity is just mistaken. If I return to that book I recommended earlier about how people learn, drawing together the science of different fields and what we know about learning, teaching and learning, that's just the contents list. So I've just named the chapters for you, and just even by looking at the list of the chapters, and even within one chapter, which seems to be about what those learning scientists were talking about in the previous slide with their 6 strategies for teaching, you'll see here those 6 strategies, quite a few of them are set within just one half of the chapter 4, which is about the processes supporting learning. So what you've got in red, those 6 strategies coming from the learning scientists, is just a tiny sliver of what is actually pertinent to your practice as a teacher. And that's just within chapter 4 alone. That's completely disregarding chapter 6, which is about motivation to learn. Intrinsic motivations, the importance of goals, the social and cultural influences of motivation. And then if you look at the other chapter headings, you can just see how much is being left out if we only draw on a very small sliver of work within a tiny part of cognitive psychology. So if learning is modeled simplistically as a matter of moving information from short to long-term memory, we risk ignoring perception and attention, just for example, as features of cognition. We need to broaden your frame of reference. So I've just put a couple of things up there. And this is still within cognitive psychology. It's just more than what the learning scientists were talking about. This is about causes of inattention, things that get in the way of our attention. So the point is this: as you read and receive guidance from whomever, be aware that you are prone to thinking that you've got the lot, that you've seen it and you've got the measure of what you're looking at, or that they have, that they think they know what they're talking about because they've got the whole and not just a part of it. It's something that we really need to be aware of. Second thing that I think is really helpful if we're aware of it is the issue with our ruler, the sort of measurements that we're using. And here I said, you know, a 12-inch ruler can only measure 12-inch things. And there are different methodologies within social science research. Again, this is a nice blog, and if you want to go to the learning scientists on this, it's really helpful. And they talk about 3 different types of research: descriptive research, correlation research, and true experiments. And I really do recommend that you find out what these different types of research methodologies are and how that matters in your being a healthy consumer of research, so that you understand the status of the claim that you're reading about or the research that you're reading about. Why am I messing about with ice cream and a crime scene? Well, it's a funny example of correlations, that middle type of research there, correlation research, where as the data on the number of ice creams that are eaten increases, so does murder rate. And that is because there's a correlation between number of ice creams eaten and number of murders. But a correlation doesn't mean a causal relationship. So just because it's not eating ice cream that is making you murder, it just happens to be that there must be a third variable, or any number of variables that isn't in the experiment, which is actually causing the phenomena to happen. But we know that the two are correlated to each other. So it really is worth getting your head around making sure you're spotting what is the status of the claim and what's the status of the research that you're reading about, and because that influences what you can do with it. And just in terms of the basics of social science research, it would be remiss of me not to mention some of the key terms. So key terms: RCTs, randomized control trials, and another would be effect sizes. And again, I'm not going into it now, beyond just saying, look, here's a definition of effect sizes. So it's to do with the statistical value, and effect size is a statistical value that tells you how much an intervention works. In other words, the larger the effect size, the stronger the relationship between the two variables. You might use it when you want to know the effect of an intervention or treatment on an experimental group compared to a control group. So if you were testing the effect size of spaced practice on recall, the magnitude of the effect size would tell you if the spaced practice had a small, medium, or large effect on recall. The other idea of randomized control trials, that's a particular type of research that is favoured by, I've written it there as the EEF, that's the Education Endowment Fund, which is the organisation which receives our government funding for research into education. And that's the sort of research, that randomised control trial, a very particular form of research that they are interested in promoting. And understanding why and what that is worth your while. With that notion of effect size and how one thing is bringing about another, or what sort of strength of correlation might there be between two things. There's a very famous book, Visible Learning, by John Hattie, and Hattie received quite a lot of criticism for the calculations of effect size used within his work. So it really is a minefield out there, and being research literate as a student teacher and as a teacher is about understanding these terms and how research is done to be a good consumer of research. And the last point I would put on just the basics of the social science research is that just think about the difference between something that's happening, a research experiment that's being reported as occurring within a very controlled environment like a lab, compared to what happens in a classroom. And we're back to the idea of throwing a rock versus throwing a bird. And this is that blog from the Learning Scientists talking about the different types of research. And they do try to mitigate against the ways in which you need to be much more tentative about the claims as a researcher that you're making within a classroom, where you really can't have the level of control that you might have in a laboratory setting. So it really is worth thinking about these things, because it will make you a better reader of research, and it will help temper your application of research claims in your practice. And that's just all by way of saying, you know, we do have a ruler problem, and the ruler can only measure particular things, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to not imagine that it can do more than it can actually do, and we need to understand the way that the ruling device, the way in which we're looking at investigating something, is influencing what we find. There's a lovely analogy actually of going fishing, and the size of the knots in a fishing net determines the sorts of catch that come in. And the mistake is to think that what you've caught using a particular net with holes of a particular size is what's in the ocean, rather than part and parcel of the size of net that you've been using. So worth really thinking about the rulers that we're using, and also thinking about how prone we are to prioritizing things that can be measured. Memory retrieval practice can be measured quite easily, especially in very controlled situations with a very narrow definition of memorize these 20 items sitting on a table, or these 20 words or something. But just because it's easy to measure, and therefore you might have quite a robust finding about a particular feature of memory, that doesn't mean that the other things that aren't easy to measure aren't important. And actually there's a tendency to let those other things that we can't measure very readily fall away and recede from our attention. And again, that's another mistake. So just being aware of the rulers we're using, the limits of our rulers, is really helpful to us if we're going to be research literate. Now, there's the notion here of changing lanes, and what I mean by that is this is a blog by Daniel Willingham, and again, I would recommend that you go to his blog and his webpage and look at his work, because it is so useful. But this is an example of where he goes, actually, I got it wrong. So here's a quote: "I've been very skeptical of 21st century skills. My skepticism grew out of what I perceived as a neglect of domain knowledge among the proponents of 21st century skills. Most of student time should be devoted to math, science, reading, civics, history, etc. Sam Weinberg's recent research shows that I was wrong." So this is Willingham saying, you know, I made all of these dismissive comments about how class time should be spent. I'm a cognitive psychologist, but I'm telling teachers how they should spend class time because I've made a pronouncement about, you know, there's no such thing as 21st century skills, and if there is, it can't be taught and it shouldn't be taught. And no, hands up, my bad. Actually, there's research that's just come out in another field that says actually there is really good reason to think that these approaches to education and this way of thinking about 21st century skills matters immensely. And I just think, gosh, you know, where we are at the moment in what's popular in schools in terms of this research or that research, flavour of the month, fads that we keep going through, there is no question in my mind that in time we will have our research catch up to an extent with what good teachers have already always been doing and already know. And we'll look back and we'll go, oh gosh, you know, how arrogant that we thought that this was what was happening and that this would be what we had to focus on, and we, you know, disregarded so many other things, and we made these pronouncements about other things that don't matter, and actually our reading of the situation was quite poor. It's just so frustrating, because just a little bit more intellectual humility and a little bit more caution would stand us in really good stead. And so I feel badly for Daniel Willingham and for us, because someone with enormous sway just going, I was wrong, doesn't quite undo the damage. So my third piece of advice to you really, when you're getting tooled up for being research literate, is just be aware of people when they change lanes, and be aware of you doing it yourself, where you take a piece of information, a piece of knowledge from one domain of knowledge, knowledge, and you translate it into another, and you go beyond, you assert more than you have warrant for, or you misinterpret it because you're applying it in a different setting. And understand that that issue is built into our predicament, that there's no way that we can't draw on the information from other fields of study unless it's filtered for us through somebody trying to simplify it. So you've got to be aware that this isn't something we get to, oh, we'll get over this. No, this is going to be a problem that's with us all the time, because the research to be usable has to be made accessible, and the making of it, the turning it into something accessible for teachers, because they're busy and they're working in a different field, etc., is a distortion of sorts, and that is something we need to get our heads around. So what can we get from cognitive psychology, for example, the empirical generalizations coming? We can get a lot, and it will help us in our practice, but really it can only go so far. And I'm so wary of the researchers, or even politicians, or even educationalists within you know, these gurus, these consultants in education who make these pronouncements. It's alarming, and it is a case of changing lanes. They're asserting more than they have the right to say, because they don't understand the implications of what they're saying, because they're not experts in, for example, history education, or they're not experts in your school and its context and your pupils. So if we take something like Rosenshine's principles, that is really helpful. You know, I have no problem. Perhaps the first one is a slightly dubious, I'd be dubious of, depending on what it means, because I really don't think every lesson should begin with a short review of previous learning. But the point with Rosenshine's principles there, which are very, very popular in schools at the moment, is that they seem really sensible to me, depending on what you actually mean by it. And that's, the devil is in the detail. The devil is in the application. And there isn't evidence about how these things should be applied, because there can't be, because it's subject specific and it's content specific. And these people don't have the wherewithal to be able to, nor could they be able to translate these things for your practice. You have to do that. What strikes me as alarming about some of the work that's out there at the minute, or is popular, is I'm thinking, gosh, what is the state of your induction into teaching if these guidelines, which are really useful but incredibly basic, are revolutionary for you? Like, where on earth did you learn to teach, or how were you learning to teach, if it's news to you that you should be providing models, or that, you know, you want to try to obtain a high success rate, or you want to engage students in review? I mean, seriously, that these are the findings, and that this is news to people within education is alarming. What I want for our PGCE and the way that we're working is that we take this and move on. Move on to the things that are hard. Move on to the things that are actually now you're ready for and are getting in the way of you being able to reach more pupils and teach better. And that is, you know, how do you do each of these things? Using what materials, in what proportion of the lesson? When does it come in the lesson? What is the way to think about these things that will help you to make them effective in your practice? And there isn't research to help you with that. That's where we come to the second idea of understand the research that's there, but you also need to be developing your professionalism and your professional judgment in your practice as a researcher. So beware of changing lanes, and especially if you're drawing classroom implications beyond your specialism. Lastly, that notion of only seeing what we are ready to see or what we want to see. What can we do about that? Well, just being aware of it is helpful. And just ask yourself, you know, what am I using to critique my reading and to critique my application of that reading in my practice? And that's just a little diagram there about, you know, our own confirmation bias and what it is. How it's a joke really about how we respond to the advice that we're given or to the reading that we've undertaken, depending on our existing opinions about things. So you can ask yourself, and it's really helpful, what stance am I taking towards the literature? Am I pilfering it for stuff I like? Am I joining in a chorus and praising at the feet of some new education consultant or guru as their disciple? Am I mining it for its value? Am I trampling it as worthless? And as you're doing that, there's a saying in Northern Ireland, catch yourself on, which really means just be self-aware about what you're doing when you are reading research and when you are applying it and evaluating it in your own practice. And think about what outlets are you using. Are you just, you know, a teacher you happen to like at school says it, or it happens to fit in with what you already think, or you read it in a tweet, or, you know, there's a blog about it and this person's sold like a zillion books on whatever, so why not? Just be a bit more self-aware about your criteria and about what you're doing. And look out for people within the field of education who are incredibly self-aware. I'm not going to read this slide to you at all. The link is there, but this is a researcher working in literacy and reading comprehension. And the reason I've just flagged it here is because the guy has just finished a blog talking about his where he sees merit in particular strategies towards reading comprehension. And but what's lovely is that he then stops and gives you the caveats. He tells you what's wrong and what could go wrong with what he's just been advocating. Now that's what we need. We need that kind of, if somebody is just saying, right, here's all my evidence for something, and that's the end of the story, we've got a problem, because there is evidence against it, and there's evidence of problems with it, and there's evidence of other things, and not to be open and explicit about that is problematic. So should be alarm bells ringing when you see other people doing it, or when you read it, or you look at this polemical, especially on social media now, polemical stance on things which are pigeonholing people into particular boxes that really isn't what we're after in terms of rigorous and robust thinking about our profession. So that was my last point. So beware of how prone we are to seeing only what we want to see or what we're ready to see. Check yourself. So I've gone through 3 parts to the lecture. I want you to think of yourself as a consumer and a producer of research in part 1. I want you to think of yourself as needing a rich frame of reference, which you approach as a practical theorizer. And I want you to understand and have a good grasp of what research can and cannot do for you. And then lastly, in part 3, I've talked about, to be able to use research well, to understand it and use it well, you need a rich frame of reference and a disposition to investigate, drawing on a basic grasp of research, and the ability to question and test your reading and your application of research. And I've offered you 4 tools to help with that process of questioning and testing: the part-whole problem, the ruler problem, the changing lanes problem, and the problem that we all face, which is seeing what we want to see or what we're ready to see. And I hope that's been helpful. Asking what works is phrasing the question wrong. We want to get you classroom ready in the sense of helping you to achieve minimal practical competence, to allow you to get through a lesson in which pupils learn something, and some of which is what you wanted to teach. But we want you to feel classroom ready so you have the headspace to think about the qualities of those competencies and the effects your actions are having on pupils' learning. In other words, we want you to become profession ready, that is able to ask and answer what works, under what conditions, and to what end. I hope that helps in thinking about research literacy in teacher education.